So welcome, thank you for watching last week. This is the second session of the series that I'm doing. It's looking at wet felting, how I create a picture. We looked last week at the photographs, so developing the idea. This week looking at wet felting. Next week I'll look at embroidery, finishing off and things like that. I am Jenny Orwin. I'm a textile artist. I mostly do landscapes. I love being outdoors, so what the pictures that I do are very much inspired by my being outdoors and my love of being at the time I spend outdoors. I will apologise now if my small daughter Eleanor appears. Hopefully she won't, but apologies if she turns up and goes, "Mommy!" So if you want to have a look at the photograph that was the original inspiration photograph, that was attached to the two posts about this workshop. It's also on my website. If you have a look at the resources page on my website, www.threadsofstillness.co.uk, if you look at the resources page, there's a subheading under there for the video series. On there, there's a big version of the photograph. There's also a link to a PDF download which has a summary of what we talked about last week. I'll do one for this week. It might take a bit longer than planned. Last week's did, because small daughter wanting to help with everything and join in with everything. But that's on. I'll put a link in the comments page afterwards. So if you want to have a bit of a summary, have a look at the photograph. It's all on there. There's also a supplies tab on my website as well under resources. So if you want to know what companies I've used, they're not affiliate links or anything like that, but there's some links on there. It's not exhaustive, but some of the companies that I've used for wool, for threads, all that type of thing, that's now all on my website as well. I will keep adding to it as I remember companies that I use. If you're just joining us, I'm Jenny and I'm talking about how I go about wet felting my pictures. So last week we talked about the photograph. As I said, it's available on the Facebook page now under the previous couple of posts. I took it in the Scottish Borders that was November 2015. We were on holiday there, and snowy day. Well, it was a snowy week actually. Hills in the background, trees, snowy foreground. So that's the inspiration photograph. I'm just going to pin that up so I can see it while I'm working. A very high-tech system of some string and pegs round the neck of the tailor's dummy that I've got in the studio, but it works very well. So, going on to wet felting, every single wet felter that I've come across has a slightly different process and does it slightly differently. There's lots of ways of doing it depending on exactly what you're making, whether you're wanting to make something really robust, like a bag that has a job to do and therefore needs to be strong enough to keep its shape and hold things, or whether you're making something like this, which is much more delicate. It's not going to need to hold anything or be particularly robust. So how you do it depends on what you're making. It also, essentially when it comes down to it, felting is generally about warm water, soap, friction. So exactly how you combine those, exactly how you achieve those, everybody has slightly different ways of doing it. This isn't the right way. If you've seen it done different ways, they all work, and they're all slightly different and all work for slightly different purposes. So don't worry if you're looking thinking, but that's not quite the same way as I did it, saw it done somewhere else. There are lots of slight variations. So the idea behind felting is that wool fibres have lots and lots of very tiny scales on them, and the hot water and the soap helps those fibres to swell slightly and pushes out the scales, and then the scales interlock and lock together really tightly. And once they've locked together, it's really, really strong. Felt is incredibly strong stuff. So as I said, it's warm water or hot water, soap, friction, all the things you don't want to do to a really nice, expensive woolen jumper. And it's why you don't want to put it in a really hot wash, because that's all the things you don't want to do to the jumper, is what we're doing now to create a piece of felt. So set up a basic towel, just to sort of collect the excess water and stop it going all over the floor. Piece of bubble wrap, bubble side up, and spare towels nearby is always very, very handy. Starting off by laying out the base layers. The base layer, which is a little bit like your equivalent to your paper or your canvas if you're, say, painting. We talked last week about choosing the colour of the base layer, and I've gone for quite a cool shade of white because the picture itself has quite cool tones to it. It's a sort of cold, snowy day. There's quite a lot of blues in the whites, so I've gone for a quite cool shade. I tend to not use lots and lots of layers of felt, so the base layer will show through and does influence all the other colours. So for me, it's quite important to choose the base colour carefully, because it is quite obvious. I'm just going to get a bit of black card just to show you, because white on white bubble wrap on a white towel is going to be really not very obvious. So let's see if I can get this in. When I'm drawing out the wool, I'm wanting to just get it. If you're getting it in tops, it comes like this, is very, very sort of long, almost rope type thing. I find the end, and using fingers to the heel of my hand, just getting the very, very end of it. I don't want huge lumps of it, because huge lumps won't work very well and you'll just end up with looking really lumpy. So I'm just wanting to tease out or pull out the very, very end, and you can see on that it's almost just wisps of fibre. I don't want huge lumps in one go. So I'm going to start laying that out. When you felt it, wool will shrink by merino. It depends on the breed it is. Merino shrinks somewhere between 20, 25, 30%, depending on how much you work it. So when I'm laying it out, I need to allow for that much shrinkage. I'm aiming for 5 by 5 in the end. So, and that's going to be the size of the aperture of the mount I'm using. So I want the felt piece in the end to be slightly bigger than 5 by 5. I don't want it only just fitting, and I don't want it to end up being too small. So I do this size quite a lot, so I've got a square marked on my bubble wrap, which is about 8 by 8 inches, which should allow for a reasonable amount of shrinkage and not be panicking at the end that my felt is going to be too small for what I'm planning. It's worth thinking a little bit. As you can see, I'm laying out pulling out the fibres and laying them out in horizontal for the first layer. It's worth thinking about the direction. Most of the time I do it this way, horizontal first. I'm going to do 2 layers of the base layer, so this is horizontal, then I'll do a vertical layer, and then my 3rd layer, which is when I'll start adding colours, will be horizontal again. Because I'm doing a landscape where I've got a horizontal line of hills and then the foreground and so on, my 3rd layer, which is where I add the colour, those will work much better if they're going more or less horizontal. If I have the layers going sort of perpendicular to each other, so horizontal, vertical, and then more or less horizontal, it felts much more easily. Whereas if all the fibres are going in the same direction, it's much harder to get it to felt. It doesn't work as well. So, as I said, the vast majority of the time I'm doing it this way, starting off horizontal, then a vertical layer of the background colour, and then a horizontal layer when I start adding colour. So I'm just working down. I don't need it to be particularly thick. As I said, this is for a picture, which I'm going to put in a frame. It doesn't need to be particularly robust. It's not going to be used as such. It would be very different if I was felting something like a vessel or something like that, or if I was making a bag or something like that. That would need much more felt. It would need much more work, and it would be much thicker because it's different purpose. So you'd approach it differently and you'd probably use slightly different techniques. So I've done my horizontal layer, now doing the vertical layer. I'm just laying out enough that there are no obvious sort of gaps in it. So I've just got something falling over in the background. I'll just try and do this quickly so I'm not taking too long. So this is the second layer of the base. The base that I'm going to be felting onto. So, one layer all horizontal, one layer all vertical. I can't see any obvious gaps there. Normally I'd probably spend rather more time on that, but I'm just trying to do it fairly quickly so that I don't take forever. So, moving on to adding colour. It was a lovely sunny, cold, clear day, so quite a vibrant blue sky. I'll probably leave some of the white of the background to show through to suggest clouds. It's when you start adding colour, it's worth thinking about the order in which the various different areas of your picture are added, and starting from the back. So sky furthest away, then the mountains are in the distance, then the foreground, and then that just helps to get the felt layers sitting in the right place relative to each other. So I'll add the sky on. So I'll leave some areas slightly less covered than others to sort of suggest some wispy clouds. It was one of those days when they're just sort of slight wisps of cloud coming across the sky. So that'll do for that. It's then moving on to the hills. I'll put another layer of the white on for the sort of snow in the distance. Let's have a bit of let's try and suggest a little bit of sort of shape of the hills. There we are. And then as you come down the hillside, you're starting to get into the areas where there's the browns and greens of the vegetation. So a little bit of brown underneath. And normally I wouldn't be working quite as quickly as this. We'll give it a go. and it's winter time, so it's sort of mixture of browns and greens and in the colours on the hillside. It's a smaller hill. It's like, well, it's almost sort of rising hills, so put a little bit of white in there just to suggest that rise in the hillside, and again coming down into the brown. I'm going to put a small amount of very wispy brown further up the hillside where the snow is just thinning and you're just starting to see the brown of the vegetation coming through. There's a couple of places where you've got quite definite lines of vegetation, so I'll add those in with some more brown. If I was doing a proper one, I'd probably spend much more time on this and probably add more colours in as well, so I'll probably get a darker, I might see if I've got, this will do. Use this one as slightly darker brown for where you've got lines. I think it's probably rocks showing through. Look a bit more of that further up the hillside where you've got areas of just boulders and so on showing through. So that's very rough, very quick. The hills in the distance, not left quite as much space as I wanted at the bottom, but I'll work with it. Snow in the foreground. I'm not matching the colour exactly because the colour of the snow in the photograph was really dark. I think to an extent it was just the camera not really coping with the white of the snow on the hills, and then the shadow on the snow in the foreground. But at any rate, the side of the hillside, the foreground where I was, wasn't in the sun by that point, so the snow there isn't going to be a brilliant white. It's got blue tones to it. So I've got a blue here, so I'll add that on. I think I'm going to add the sort of vegetation in the foreground, probably using needle felting, I think, looking at it, and that will create a really definite line between the foreground and the hills in the background, but I'll do that with needle felting later on. I'll cover that next week. So I'll put haze of sort of blue there to sort of suggest the snow in the foreground. Add a little bit of, I was saying last week, there's particularly on this side of the hills there was a sort of pinkish tinge of the way that the light was catching the snow, so I'm just adding a sort of pinkish purplish, just a small amount, just to give that suggestion of the way the light was catching the hillside. Right, this will have to do for the moment. I'll just do it very quickly. On to adding the water bowl. At this stage it's warm water. I'm not wanting to, actually that's cooled down quite a lot. I'll add a little bit more warm to it. I don't want to completely felt it at this stage. I'm just wanting it to start to tangle together. I don't want it to sort of lock together permanently. So warm water for the time being will help it to just start to tangle together. I'll probably add more water, more layers to it rather, once I put some water on. So I need to be sure that I've completely done the wet felting stage. I've got all the layers of wool that I want on before I start adding really hot water and felting it properly. So warm water, a little bit of soap flakes, exactly what sort of soap you use doesn't really matter. Different felters use different things. Something to squirt water on, again doesn't really matter too much. I think you can get these from sort of felting equipment suppliers. I think you can also get them for houseplants. So small amount of water, it doesn't really want to be swimming. This is just sort of almost like net, polyester net curtain type thing, works quite well as well. And it just stops the fibres spreading all over the place. If I didn't have that, as soon as I started adding friction, everything would just slide and I'd lose my layout that I'd created. I'm pressing it down to make sure the water goes all the way down to through all the layers. You can tell when there's bits that it hasn't gone down because they feel slightly spongy. And at this stage I'm just using my hands just to start that process of helping the fibres to tangle together. It doesn't feel like it's... Got this. It's called a palm washboard. You can get them from Adelaide Walker, I think it is. There's a link on my website if you're trying to find that. It's designed for when you want more delicate felting, really. It works very well for that. Sorry, I've now got bits of wool stuck everywhere. Got one caught in my watch. So it's fairly gentle at the moment. As I said, I don't want to work it so much that it permanently locks together. I'm just doing enough that it starts to knit together. I have this, I like it, it works quite well. You can also do it if you roll the felt around something. It can be a pool noodle, it can be a length of piping, all sorts of different things you can use. And just as long as at this stage you're not working it too vigorously, because that's going to knit or stick all the fibres together permanently before you really want it. Right, that should be enough. Peel the net off. Have a look. Usually I spend much longer at this stage, adding more layers, having a good look. At the minute, the skyline, or the line where the mountains meet the sky, is too vague, so I'm going to add some more, a little bit more over the top of there, just to try and make it a slightly more defined line. We'll see. And I'm going to put more purple in the hillside in the distance, because that's got slightly lost in the felt. Take a bit of grass out. mop up the water that's leftover water that's there before, so I can put some more warm water on, because the water that was already on the wall has become cold. So I'll try and splash the laptop in the process. That would not go down very well. There we are. Take up the extra water, because as I said, you don't really want the fibres to be swimming. I think I'm going to stop there today, because otherwise we could be here for hours, and that's probably not what anybody's particularly wanting. Normally I'd spend much longer on this stage. Probably I quite often take photographs of it, as it's just a way to almost stand back from it. If I'm working on it for a while, I'll take a photograph of it. That makes it almost easier to stand back and go, okay, what's working, what isn't working. If I had longer, I'd probably something very odd going on there. I might put a few more bits in to suggest clouds, some wisps of cloud. Sometimes it can be quite useful to, if you take a photograph of it and then convert that photograph to black and white, or convert a copy of it to black and white, that can also sometimes help to see where it's working or not working. Right, I think that'll do for today. So, I've got to the stage of laying out all the fibres, and I'm happy with it. Or have run out of time, as today. Normally I would spend much more time carefully putting fibres in the right place and so on, rather than doing it quickly. So if I'm feeling completely happy, I'm then going to move on to felting it really more thoroughly to get the fibres to permanently lock together and make it turn into proper felt. This would be called sort of almost like pre-felt, where it's sort of temporarily tangled but not fully locked. So to do that, much hotter water for a start. So it's hot enough that your fingers can stand it, so not so hot that it burns, but oh, yeah, it'll be alright. So this is at the stage where it starts to shrink, because at the moment, so far it's not really shrunk particularly. This stage, which is called fulling, is where the fibres shrink and properly lock together. Much more vigorous at this stage, and I'll go in both directions as well. And I'll start off with too much water. Try not to get any water on the laptop. So it's starting to shrink together. That's going to need quite a bit of work. So this is a stage where you're using lots of friction, as well as properly hot water, to get the fibres to interlock. because I'm planning to use a mount that has a window, the edges of the felt will be hidden, so I don't need to worry too much about the edges. If you're making other things, you might need to worry about the edges rather more. Try and make sure we don't end up with folds in it. Take the, because the water's cooling down a bit now, so mop up the water that's on there. And replace with some more hot water. Periodically peeling the net back to check that the net hasn't tangled too much into the wool. Good test when I'm trying to work out how well it's fulled is, it's called the pinch test, is if I pinch, yeah, the fibres are still lifting up, so they're not locked in together properly. You want to get to the point where they're not lifting up when you pinch them. Sorry, I'm going to get a spare towel just to cover up the laptop. So it will not go down very well if I manage to get too much water on the laptop. And if you work in all directions, but make sure you work both vertically and horizontally, then it'll shrink in all directions as well, rather than just shrinking in one direction. Right. That's getting there. Last stage I tend to do on a mat, just helps it felt. If I did this too early, I feel like I'd risk shifting the fibres around too much. By this stage, they're reasonably well interlocked. But I'll do this the last bit. Bamboo mats. This one I think I got as sort of specific belting one, but placemats also work. Bamboo blinds also work quite well, apparently, particularly if you're doing anything bigger. Bamboo blind for something this size would be a bit out of proportion. You'd have an awful lot of blinds to cope with for a very small bit of felt. See, that's shrunk quite a bit that way. So I've done it one way, I've turned it 90 degrees, I'll do it the other way. Ideally, when you're not trying to talk as well, if you keep count of the number of times you roll it each direction, so that you felt it evenly in all the directions, rather than this, that I can't manage to talk and count at the same time and keep track of things, so I'll just have to guess. Again, this is adding more of the friction that helps it to felt. So 90 degrees again. Hang on. That way, isn't it? I think. Inside the mat, I'm going to pull out the edge. So that feels much more robust. That feels like I might work this a little bit more just to get it to felt really well. When I'm happy that this is felted really thoroughly, then it needs rinsing again quite thoroughly. If you leave any soap in with the wool, it doesn't do the wool much good at all, so you want to be taking all the soap out and make sure you've rinsed it really well. Then I'll put it to dry somewhere, and then the next stage, which I'll be talking about next week, is adding in embroidery. The plan is to add a line of trees, 3 trees along here, and some vegetation in the foreground, and I'll probably add some needle felting as well to add some more of the vegetation in the foreground, sort of grasses and things like that. I'll see how this comes out when it's dry. As I said, this was a very rushed version, so sometimes you can sort of add more later on with needle felting. I'll see how it looks when it's dry. So yeah, next week I'll be back doing another live session at 2 o'clock. So 2 o'clock each Saturday. We'll be looking at embroidery and finishing off. So this is sort of the base of the back, the wet felting, then adding all the sort of finishing touches over the top. So that'll be 2 o'clock next Saturday on Facebook. If you want to go back and look at last week's, it's available on the Facebook page. It's also available on my website. I'll put the link in the comments to my website, and there's a suppliers list as well on my website now. I did that earlier, and there's a sort of summary of last week, what we talked about last week. There's PDF download on my website, so if anybody prefers reading something and looking at a document rather than video, that's there. I'll try to do one this week for this week's session when small daughter lets me. We'll see when that is. And I think that's just about everything. Look at my list. Yeah, please, if you don't already, please follow the Facebook page or like it. And there's an email list, email newsletter, sign up on my website as well. So that's if you want to sort of keep up to date with what's going on, particularly like so next week's video or future videos I do or anything like that, then that's a good way to find out. or about any resources that I've put up that I've finally had a chance to make. So I think that was everything I needed to say. Yeah, so thank you very much for watching. It's nice, even though we can't actually get to any fairs or face-to-face workshops or anything like this, it's still nice to do things like this every so often. So thank you very much for coming. Hopefully see some of you next week, and please keep in touch, and thank you very much to any of you if you're a key worker or anything like that, and take care. I hope everybody's keeping well, hope families are keeping well as well. So yeah, see you next week. Bye bye.